For most of human history, survival on Earth should not have been possible. Not in the frozen Arctic, where temperatures drop low enough to kill an exposed human in under an hour. Not in the scorching Sahara, where the sun turns the ground into a radiating furnace and water evaporates before it can be swallowed. Not across the vast and featureless Pacific, where there is nothing in any direction but moving water and empty sky. Not beneath the ocean's surface, where pressure crushes and darkness swallows everything. Humans were never built for these places. We had no fur to trap warmth, no claws to dig for water, no biological sonar to navigate the deep, no instinct hardwired for survival in places evolution never intended us to reach. And yet, somehow, impossibly, we did not just survive these environments, we mastered them. Because humans did not adapt to Earth the way every other creature did. We did something far stranger and far more powerful. We learned how to redesign survival itself. Anthropologists have spent decades trying to understand something that does not quite make sense when you look at it honestly. Humans entered extreme environments far faster than biological evolution should have ever allowed. Most animal species require hundreds of thousands of years, sometimes millions, to develop the physiological adaptations that let them survive in genuinely hostile conditions. Polar bears evolved their dense fur and subcutaneous fat layers over enormous stretches of geological time. Camels developed their water conservation systems through countless generations of incremental biological selection. But humans? Humans moved into environments that should have killed them in timescales that make no evolutionary sense whatsoever. Archaeological evidence places anatomically modern humans in subarctic hunting grounds, in high-altitude plateaus, in deep desert interiors, within timeframes that rule out conventional biological adaptation as the explanation. This forces a conclusion that changes how we understand our entire species. Our survival advantage was never physical. It was cognitive. Humans became the first and only species in natural history whose primary evolutionary advantage was not stored in their genes but stored in their minds, and then transferred outward into objects, behaviors, and communities. Other animals adapt through genetics, a process that takes geological time and offers no shortcuts. Humans adapt through learning, a process that can happen within a single lifetime and can be transmitted to the next generation instantly. Tools became our teeth, clothing became our fur, fire became our metabolism, knowledge became our instinct. This single shift, this externalization of adaptation, may be the most consequential development in the entire 4 billion year history of life on this planet. Because it meant humans no longer needed to wait for evolution to catch up. We could invent adaptation instead. And once that door opened, nothing on Earth could close it again. The Ice Age did not just test human survival. It forced human innovation at a pace and depth that no comfortable environment ever could have produced. During the peak glacial periods, temperatures across Eurasia and the Americas plunged into ranges that would be instantly lethal to an unprotected human body. Without insulation, core temperature drops. Without shelter, exposure kills within hours. Without access to high-density, high-calorie food systems, the metabolic demands of staying warm overwhelm the body's reserves within days. There was no margin for error, no second chance, no partial solution. Either humans solved the problem completely, or they died completely. So humans did something that had never happened before in the history of life on Earth. They engineered solutions. Archaeological evidence from sites across Siberia, Eastern Europe, and the northern reaches of North America reveals that early cold climate populations developed sophisticated layered thermal systems thousands of years before the invention of writing, before agriculture, before anything we conventionally recognize as civilization. This was not improvised survival. This was applied physics, carried out by people who had no formal language for the concepts they were intuitively mastering. Caribou hide and Arctic fox fur were not chosen randomly. These materials were selected, processed, and constructed into garments that exploited the physical properties of hollow hair fibers, which trap air and create insulating dead zones that interrupt convective heat loss. The same principle that underlies modern high-performance cold-weather gear, engineered by teams of materials scientists with access to laboratories and thermal imaging technology, was understood and implemented by Ice Age hunters working with bone needles and sinew thread. They constructed layered systems where inner garments captured metabolic heat close to the skin, while outer layers blocked wind-driven convection, managing heat transfer across multiple gradient zones simultaneously. Modern thermal engineers call this a layered insulation system. Ice Age humans called it staying alive. Their shelters followed the same logic, taken to an even more remarkable extreme. The igloo is one of the most misunderstood structures in the history of human architecture. It is commonly described as a primitive snow hut, a desperate improvisation of a people with no access to better materials. This description is wrong in almost every meaningful way. The igloo is a structural compression dome, one of the most mechanically efficient architectural forms known to engineering. The geometry of the dome distributes compressive load evenly across the entire structure, which is precisely why Roman architects used the same principle to build structures that have stood for 2,000 years. Snow blocks, when cut and placed correctly, lock against each other and gain structural integrity as the dome rises, with each block pressing inward and downward against its neighbors in a self-reinforcing compression network. Meanwhile, the thermal physics of the structure are equally sophisticated. The snow itself, packed with air pockets, provides insulation. The interior air, warmed by body heat and a small oil lamp, rises and remains trapped near the sleeping area. The entrance tunnel is deliberately designed lower than the living floor, creating a cold air sink where dense cold air drains away from the living space through passive convection without any mechanical assistance. A small ventilation hole at the dome apex regulates air pressure and removes carbon dioxide. The result is an interior environment that can remain 30 to 40 degrees Celsius, warmer than the outside temperature, with no fuel source other than human body heat and a flame the size of a candle. The Ice Age did not just make humans tougher, it made them smarter, more systematic, more capable of translating environmental observation into engineered solutions. Because in a world where the margin of error was measured in hours, intelligence became the only survival strategy that actually worked. If extreme cold demanded the invention of insulation systems, extreme heat demanded something different entirely. It demanded efficiency, precision, and a deep understanding of biological systems that most modern people still do not fully appreciate. The San people of the Kalahari developed a hunting strategy so unusual and so counterintuitive that when Western researchers first documented it in detail, it caused genuine scientific controversy. The technique is called persistence hunting, and at first encounter, it appears flatly impossible. The premise seems absurd. How can a human being, who cannot outrun a springbok over any meaningful distance, successfully hunt one to exhaustion? The answer lies not in speed, but in thermodynamics, and it represents one of the most sophisticated applications of biological knowledge in all of human history. Physiological research, conducted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, confirmed what sand hunters had understood experientially for thousands of years. Humans are among the most extraordinary thermoregulators in the entire animal kingdom. We possess an eccrine sweat gland system that is unique in its density and efficiency among large mammals, capable of sustained evaporative cooling across the entire body surface over extended periods of continuous exertion. Most large African mammals, including the very prey species the sand hunted, lack this capability. They cool primarily through panting, a respiratory mechanism that becomes increasingly inefficient as exertion intensifies and duration extends. During prolonged running in high ambient temperatures, these animals face an unavoidable physiological crisis. Their internal temperature rises faster than their cooling system can compensate. Their muscle enzymes lose efficiency as thermal load increases. Motor coordination degrades. Their bodies begin forcing rest to prevent fatal hyperthermia. The sand did not hunt for speed. They hunted for biological failure. They selected the hottest hours of the day, not despite the danger, but precisely because the heat was their primary weapon. They tracked the animal at a sustainable running pace, reading footprints, disturbed vegetation, and the behavioral signs of thermal stress, with a precision that required years of accumulated observational knowledge. When the prey rested, they pushed it forward again, never allowing its core temperature to drop back to functional levels. Over the course of 2 to 5 hours, the animal's cooling system collapsed progressively and irreversibly. The hunt ended not with a weapon but with a hand, the sand hunter approaching an animal too exhausted and thermally compromised to flee, and delivering a close-range kill with minimal effort. This was not hunting through strength, it was hunting through thermodynamics. Their water management strategies reflected the same depth of biological and environmental knowledge. Ethnographic research documents the sand maintaining detailed cognitive maps of their territorial water resources across enormous geographic areas, tracking not just permanent water sources but seasonal moisture-bearing plants, dew collection zones, underground root systems accessible through specific digging techniques, and even distributed storage networks using buried ostrich eggshell containers that cached water at strategic locations across their range. This was logistics infrastructure, built without writing, without maps in any conventional sense, without any of the formal systems we associate with organized resource management. It existed entirely in human memory, transmitted across generations through direct instruction and guided experience. The desert did not reward the strongest, it rewarded the most knowledgeable. The Pacific Ocean presented a survival challenge of a fundamentally different character than anything humans had faced before. It was not temperature, it was not aridity, it was scale, and the terrifying cognitive problem that scale creates. The Pacific covers more than 60 million square miles, representing nearly a third of the entire surface of the planet. Its islands are scattered across this immensity at distances that place them far beyond visual range from one another, separated by hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles of open water with no fixed landmarks, no roads, no trail markers, nothing stable to orient against except the sky above and the ocean below. And yet, between approximately 3,000 and 1,000 years ago, Polynesian navigators crossed this ocean repeatedly, colonizing islands across a triangle stretching from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the southwest to Easter Island in the southeast, an area larger than the continental United States. They did this without compasses, without charts, without sextants, without any instrument-based navigation technology whatsoever. When modern researchers first fully grasped the scale of what Polynesian navigators had accomplished, the reaction in the scientific community ranged from skepticism to something approaching disbelief. Reconstruction voyages conducted in the late 20th century, using traditional vessels and navigation methods taught by surviving master navigators, removed any remaining doubt. The navigation was not guesswork. It was not luck, not accident, not the product of blind drift across an accommodating ocean. It was systematic, repeatable, and grounded in a body of environmental knowledge so comprehensive that it functioned as a complete navigational technology in its own right. Polynesian navigators memorized the rising and setting positions of hundreds of individual stars across the full celestial year, constructing three-dimensional mental models of the night sky that allowed them to determine latitude, track bearing drift, and identify their position relative to known star paths, even when individual stars were obscured. But celestial navigation was only one layer of a system that integrated multiple environmental data streams simultaneously. Ocean swells, generated by distant weather systems thousands of miles away, travel across the Pacific in consistent directional patterns that persist even when local wind conditions vary dramatically. Experienced navigators could read these swell patterns through physical sensation, feeling their vessel's movement with their bodies while lying on the hull, detecting the interference patterns created when two swell systems crossed, and using these patterns to maintain bearing even in cloudy conditions when celestial references were unavailable. They tracked the flight directions of specific bird species whose behavioral patterns were tied to land proximity in predictable ways. They read the color and temperature of the water, which shifts detectably near island groups due to lagoon runoff and thermal variation. They observed cloud formation patterns, recognizing the distinctive stationary clouds that form over islands and can be visible at distances far beyond the shoreline itself. In the traditional navigational framework, each island possessed a navigational identity that included all of these environmental signatures. The navigator carried this information not on paper, not in instruments, but in a trained human mind capable of integrating multiple data streams simultaneously and making decisions accurate enough to hit a target island miles across after weeks at sea. Their vessels reflected the same engineering intelligence. The double-hull catamaran design that Polynesian navigators developed distributes buoyancy across two parallel hulls connected by a rigid platform, dramatically increasing stability in open ocean conditions while reducing drag. The hulls were built to flex slightly under wave stress rather than resist rigidly, distributing hydrodynamic forces across the entire structure and reducing the risk of catastrophic failure in severe sea states. The fiber lashings that connected structural elements served the same purpose, allowing controlled micro-movement that absorbed wave energy without compromising structural integrity. These were not primitive boats pressed into service for desperate voyages. They were highly optimized long-distance survival platforms, designed by builders who understood wave dynamics, load distribution, and materials performance through generations of accumulated practical engineering knowledge. The Polynesians demonstrate something essential about how humans survive. We do not conquer environments through force. We conquer them through pattern recognition, through the accumulation and transmission of observational knowledge sophisticated enough to extract navigational signal from environmental noise across planetary scales. Most human adaptations to extreme environments operate at the level of culture and technology. Humans invent tools, develop techniques, accumulate knowledge, and transmit solutions across generations. But in some cases, where cultural pressure and environmental demand have remained constant for long enough and intense enough, something more fundamental occurs. The adaptation moves from culture into biology, from behavior into genetics, and from technique into physiology. The Bajau people of Southeast Asia, sometimes called sea nomads, provide what is perhaps the most striking known example of this process in the modern human species. For at least 1,000 years, possibly significantly longer, the Bajau have lived primarily on and in the ocean, spending their lives on boats and in the water in ways that distinguish them from virtually every other human population on Earth. Traditional Bajau divers descend to depths of 60 meters or more on a single breath, spending the majority of their working day submerged in repeated dives that would be physiologically challenging for any trained free diver, let alone a general population, including men, women, and children across all age groups. Genetic research published in 2018 by scientists at the University of Copenhagen identified something remarkable about the Bajau. Compared to genetically similar neighboring populations who follow terrestrial lifestyles, the Bajau possess spleens that are substantially larger on average, approximately 50% larger by volume. The spleen functions as a reservoir for oxygenated red blood cells. During the dive reflex, a physiological response triggered by facial immersion in cold water that exists in all mammals, the spleen contracts and releases its stored red blood cells into circulation, dramatically increasing the blood's oxygen-carrying capacity and extending the duration of safe apnea. A larger spleen means a larger oxygen reserve, which means longer, deeper, more productive dives. The research identified specific genetic variants in the Bajau that are associated with spleen size and that appear to have been under positive natural selection, meaning individuals carrying these variants survived and reproduced more successfully in the Bajau cultural environment, gradually increasing the prevalence of these variants in the population over generations. The Bajau also show enhanced expression of the dive reflex itself, with heart rate slowing more rapidly and dramatically upon submersion and peripheral vasoconstriction, routing blood away from non-essential tissues toward the brain and heart more efficiently than in non-diving populations. These responses are present in all humans as a vestigial mammalian inheritance, but in the Bajau, they appear amplified to a degree that moves them toward a genuinely distinct physiological profile. What makes the Bajau case so conceptually significant is not just what it reveals about them specifically, but what it implies about human evolution more broadly. The Bajau demonstrate that the line between cultural adaptation and biological adaptation is not a fixed boundary, but a permeable gradient. Behavior shapes environment. Environment shapes selection pressure. Selection pressure shapes biology. Culture and evolution are not separate processes in the human species. They are interactive systems, each influencing the other in feedback loops that continue to operate wherever survival demands remain sufficiently consistent across sufficient time. Human evolution is not finished. It continues wherever the pressure is real enough and sustained enough to leave a mark in the genome. We are not separate from nature. We are still, right now, in the middle of responding to it. When anthropologists and evolutionary biologists began systematically comparing human adaptation strategies across extreme environments, a pattern emerged that was too consistent to be coincidental and too profound to be easily summarized. Arctic survival, desert survival, deep ocean survival, high-altitude survival, environments separated by thousands of miles, cultures with no historical contact, technologies developed in complete independence from one another. And yet the underlying logic of the solutions was strikingly similar. Not identical in form, but convergent in structure. Every successful extreme environment human culture had developed systems for storing knowledge externally to individual minds, transmitting it reliably across generations, and applying it flexibly to novel situations within familiar frameworks. Every successful culture had developed technologies that extended human biological capabilities beyond their baseline parameters, using materials and environmental understanding to substitute for physiological traits that evolution had not provided. Every successful culture had developed social structures that distributed specialized knowledge across communities so that the loss of any single individual did not result in the loss of the system. The pattern scientists recognized was not a specific technology or a specific behavior, it was a strategy. Humans do not wait to evolve. We identify the problem, develop the solution, test it against reality, refine it through accumulated experience, and transmit the refined version to the next generation, who begins not at zero, but at the level where the previous generation stopped. And then, in some cases, over enough time, and with enough consistent pressure, evolution follows the behavior, reinforcing biologically what culture established technologically. This is what separates the human species from every other form of life that has ever existed on this planet. We are not the strongest animals. We are not the fastest. We are not the most physically specialized for any particular environment. We are the fastest problem solvers at the civilizational scale. And problem-solving scales faster than biology. It always has, and the gap is widening. The most important realization about human survival technologies is not what they allowed humans to do in the past, but what they became over time. The thermal systems developed by Ice Age Arctic hunters did not remain limited to keeping individual people alive in immediate cold. They became the foundation of textile technology, driving innovations in fiber processing, weaving, and material science that eventually produced every form of cloth-based technology in the modern world. The navigational knowledge, encoded in Polynesian star paths and swell patterns, did not remain limited to island-hopping voyages across the Pacific. It became the conceptual foundation of trade network development, of cartography, of systematic environmental observation, of the scientific tradition of careful, empirical data collection that eventually produced modern astronomy, oceanography, and meteorology. The food preservation and storage systems developed by desert and Arctic peoples, the dried meats, the fermented foods, the oil-rendered fats, the grain caches, the distributed storage networks. did not remain limited to keeping small bands alive through lean seasons. They became the technological prerequisite for agriculture, enabling the surpluses that allowed population density to rise, specialization to emerge, and the division of labor that underlies every complex society in history. The shelter engineering principles that built igloos and earthen longhouses and cliff dwellings did not remain limited to keeping small groups warm and dry. They became the conceptual foundation of architecture, of structural engineering, of urban planning, of every built environment that humans have constructed, from the earliest permanent settlements to the towers of modern cities. The plant knowledge accumulated by desert foragers and tropical peoples, the medicinal properties, the toxic thresholds, the preparation techniques that made dangerous plants, nutritious and poisonous plants, therapeutic, became the empirical foundation of pharmacology. Civilization did not appear suddenly as a breakthrough event. It emerged as the inevitable consequence of survival knowledge accumulating, connecting, scaling, and combining across generations and across cultures. Cities are survival technologies applied at population scale. Infrastructure is survival technology institutionalized. Modern medicine is survival technology systematized. Every element of the built human world traces its conceptual lineage back to someone, somewhere, facing an environment that should have killed them, and choosing instead to understand it well enough to survive. If you ask most people what single invention most enabled humans to dominate Earth, the answers tend toward the obvious candidates. Fire, perhaps, which extended warmth and cooking capabilities and deterred predators. Stone tools, which extended the effective reach of human physical capability. Agriculture, which enabled population growth and settlement. These are reasonable answers. They are also incomplete ones. Each of these technologies is real, significant, and genuinely transformative. But each of them is also a consequence of something earlier and more fundamental, something that made all of them possible, and that made the development of each one inevitable once the earlier thing existed. The real invention, the one that underlies every other human technology and without which none of the others could have developed or persisted, is cumulative knowledge. Not knowledge itself, which other animals possess in limited forms, but cumulative knowledge, the specific and extraordinary human capacity to encode solutions in forms that exist outside individual minds, to transmit those encoded solutions with high fidelity across generations, to allow each generation to inherit the solutions of all previous generations rather than rediscovering them from zero, and to build incrementally on that inherited foundation in ways that create a compounding technological trajectory with no natural ceiling. Every other animal species that has ever existed has faced each generation of environmental challenge essentially from scratch. Individual animals learn. Some even teach limited behaviors to their offspring, but the scope of transmission is narrow, the fidelity is imperfect, and the accumulation is minimal. Each generation of wolves, of elephants, of chimpanzees faces the world with roughly the same cognitive toolkit as the generation before. Humans faced each new generation with an inherited library that grew with every passing century, containing not just the solutions their parents developed, but the solutions their grandparents developed, and their great-grandparents before them, stretching back in an unbroken chain of accumulated problem-solving to the first moment a human being figured out how to preserve knowledge in a form that could survive their own death. This created something evolution had never produced before in 4 billion years of biological history. A species that improves faster than its environment can eliminate it. A species for whom the challenge of today is never faced with the resources of yesterday, but always with the resources of every day before it combined. Animals inherit instincts, which are fixed, slow to change, and incapable of being consciously modified. Humans inherit solutions, which are flexible, rapidly improvable, and explicitly designed to be passed forward better than they arrived. This is not a weapon, it is not a structure, It cannot be held or pointed at a problem. It is an idea, the most powerful survival idea any organism has ever had, and every human being alive today is the direct beneficiary of the long chain of minds that developed and preserved it. Humans are not the best adapted species on Earth. There are animals better suited to cold, better suited to heat, better suited to aquatic environments, better suited to high altitude, better suited to darkness, better suited to nearly every specific environmental condition that exists on this planet. A polar bear is a more efficient cold weather organism than any human being who has ever lived. A camel is a more efficient desert organism. A sperm whale is a more efficient deep-sea organism. Measured against any individual environment, humans lose the comparison almost every time. But this is precisely the wrong comparison to make, because the question was never which species fits a single environment best. The question was, which species could survive the broadest range of environments, adapt to novel conditions fastest, and transmit those adaptations forward with enough fidelity to build on them generationally. By those measures, the answer is not even close. Other animals fit environments. Humans reshape survival to fit themselves. Evolution shaped our bodies, and the result was an organism that is genuinely mediocre at surviving in extreme conditions by biological standards alone. But knowledge shaped our survival strategies, and the result was an organism that has successfully inhabited every climate zone on Earth, that has survived ice ages and droughts and volcanic winters and epidemics, that has crossed every ocean and descended into every depth and climbed every mountain range. Not because any of those environments suited us, but because we suited ourselves to them through the accumulated application of understood solutions. This may be the real reason humans did not just survive Earth. It may be the reason we are still here to ask the question at all. If you find yourself drawn to these deeper stories of human history, to the hidden technologies and forgotten knowledge systems that made our species what it is, then subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows. Because before agriculture, before writing, before anything we call civilization, survival was our first and greatest invention. And at the beginning of this story, we asked how humans survived environments they were never built for. The answer is as simple and as extraordinary as the species itself. We were not built for them. We learned how to build survival instead.